Welcome, everyone. Hi, I'm Cecily Cook, the Asian Cultural Council's Director of Grantee and Alumni Relations. We're honored to partner this afternoon with the Hyde Park Arts Center for today's conversation with three really remarkable artists. ACC began this online public program series in dialogues as an avenue to continue our work in advancing international understanding and respect through cultural exchange, and to provide a platform for diverse voices of artists and arts professionals from across Asia and the United States. ACC and Hyde Park began conversations in 2017 on how we might partner in a way that would be mutually beneficial to both organizations to create opportunities for artists and arts professionals in Hyde Park's community to participate in ACC's program, undertaking residencies in Asia, and for ACC to serve a wider and more diverse population in the United States with a particular focus on supporting community-based artists working outside of the Northeast. It's been a tremendous learning opportunity for us at ACC to be brought into Hyde Park's dynamic and vibrant community. And working together, ACC and Hyde Park have been able to place artists from Myanmar and Malaysia in Chicago, and to place Chicago-based artists in residence in Vietnam. We had planned for continued in-person exchange this year, but during this period when we're not able to physically send people from Asia here or from the US to Asia, we've been developing ways to continue the engagement via virtual programming, such as today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator for today, Megha Ralapati, curator, writer, and manager of the Jackman Goldwasser Residency at the Hyde Park Arts Center. Megha?
Thank you so much, Cecily. Many thanks to ACC and to the whole team who helped organize today's program. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Megha Ralapati. I'm the residency manager at Hyde Park Arts Center in Chicago. I'd like to warmly welcome you to our conversation today, Our Futures Are Tied. Before I introduce the artists who will be sharing the space today, I'd like to give a little bit of context on our topic. So we found ourselves in a moment that's wholly unprecedented. This is a moment of heightened complexity in nearly every way, socially, politically, spiritually. And the German philosopher, Walter Benjamin, had a very apt phrase to describe a moment like this. He called it now time. And now time describes a moment that's ripe and rich with possibility, full of energy. It's a moment that has great potential that's begging to be unlocked, demanding transformation. At the same time, this moment can be described through astrology as it's practiced in India, and it's interestingly kind of described in a similar way. Some people believe that the movement and the alignment of the planets over this year have dictated some of the upheaval and crises that we have been experiencing. And they believe that we are slowly ushering into a new era of increased equilibrium, expanded balance, and restoration. But inside of this new type of balance is a fundamental reordering and a reorienting. So we'll have to see about that. But with some of those ideas in mind, the shifts in power, kind of the movement of tectonic plates, realignment, the potential for change, the potential for transformation, keeping those things in mind, I would love to introduce three artists whose work speaks directly to these concepts. First up, Aram Sifuentes is a fiber and social practice artist who works to claim spaces for immigrant and disenfranchised communities. Aram's work often revolves around skill sharing to create multi-ethnic and intergenerational sewing circles, which become a place for empowerment, subversion, and protest. Next, Carol Zoe is a cultural producer who facilitates creative social change projects with a focus on racial justice, informal labor, and public space. And finally, Weston Teruya is an artist who moves fluidly between individual and collective modes of practice. Weston is part of Related Tactics, a collective of transdisciplinary artists of color who create projects at the intersection of race and culture. Hello, welcome. Thank you for being here, all of you. It's so good to be with you and kind of pretend that we're in the same room. We have a lot to talk about today. We have to talk about democracy. We have to talk about social change. We have to talk about racial justice. But before we get into all of those things, I'd like to invite each of you to share a project or two that you're working on currently, something that speaks urgently for you to this moment. So we'll just jump right in. We'll kick it off with you, Aram.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to ACC and Megha for the introduction, and I will jump into my presentation. Oops, I'm going to speak pretty quickly because I have a lot to cover. So I'm going to talk about the project I'm currently working on and started in 2016 called the Official Unofficial Voting Station, Voting for All Who Legally Can't. So quickly, just because it isn't really common knowledge on who can't legally vote, I like to start here, right? So who can't legally vote in the US? And these are graphics that me and a collaborator, Ishita Jarap, created. So youth under 18 is the largest group, non-citizens. Then quickly, the third largest group are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people, depending on what state you are residing in. And so the Sentencing Project in 2016 estimated that 6.1 million people were disenfranchised due to these laws. So yeah, state by state, if we look at it a little closer, Maine and Vermont, you can legally vote in prison. 18 states, when you're in prison, you lose your right. 3 states, prison parole, 17 prison parole probation, and 11 states have much stricter laws. And in some of these states, you can lose your right to vote forever, such as Kentucky and Virginia. So of course, when we look at this, we know that felony disenfranchisement policies disproportionately impact communities of color, particularly brown and Black communities. So the fourth largest group are residents of US territories. So residents of US territories can vote in the primaries. They cannot vote in the presidential elections. They have, non-voting members in the House of Representatives and no Senate representation. So residents of US territories, once they move to the mainland, they can have voting rights. However, not American Samoans, because they are US nationals and not citizens. And then the fifth largest group, people are disenfranchised due to the ID requirements by state, right? So if your state requires a strict government issued photo ID and you don't have that, then you are disenfranchised. So common misperception is that unhoused populations can't legally vote, and oftentimes it's because of this. They might fall in number 5. They can't get specific IDs. So that's how that goes. So yeah, with this research, I was pretty surprised that it wasn't more readily available. And as you could see, I was looking for graphics to share this information and not being able to find them and having to make them myself, right? So it was unclear how large this population was until 2016, after the elections actually, where the US Election Project Census Bureau showed this data that 28.6% of the population was ineligible to vote. So that's about 92 million people. So with that, and of course this list doesn't even address voter suppression, right? Which I'll go more into later. So in 2016, I started this project, and with the Jane Addams Hull House Museum between September 8th and November 8th, I collaborated with over 15 artists, activists, organizations, and we created more than 25 different voting stations all over the US and Mexico. And each of these took on different forms. So some were performative, uses pedagogical tools, public interactive artworks. And it wasn't meant to be a scientific demographic undertaking, but a series of interconnected gestures meant to empower disenfranchised people. So this station was by Cecilia Aguilar Castillo and Eric Fernandez Saldana, who live in Mexico City. And they did stations in Mexico City and Tijuana. So it was one of my favorite stations from 2016, just because of how sort of dystopic and performative it was. So people would come and vote on the ballots, the official, unofficial ballots with fake blood for the candidates. And then they would vote against the candidates. So they had like syringes and screws that you could stab into their heads to like represent a vote against them, which I love. And then in Acapulco, they went full on human effigies with wooden crosses. And then as a souvenir, you would come and cut out a bird from an American flag. And after the station Tijuana, this is Cecilia who called me to tell me that she was throwing all the votes and ballots over the border. And so in the spirit of freedom, celebration, difference, and fun at the Jane Addams Hull House, this was an installation I created with Lisa Holler-Baggison and DJ Sadie Woods. We did sort of a disco theme installation where we could dance or protest. And for those who can't legally vote, Election Day becomes a day where we're invisible and silent. So we wanted to have all these celebrations to protest and dance and celebration. So we did a bunch of programs and events on Election Day. So piñata border wall making with Yvette Mayorga, an election viewing party with Roberto Sifuentes and DJ Sadie Rock. Sadie Rock, she used to go by Sadie Rock, but Sadie Woods actually. And so the results, we had over 4,000 votes, and Clinton won with 2,356 votes. And so this is what the ballots looked like. Very simple. I'm voting here because in 5 different languages, and then you're able to vote for your candidates. I'm going to go back to that in a second. So for the 2020 election, I started creating these 50 voting kits for the disenfranchised. So, and also this being a collective part of the project. So Ishita and I created the stickers, undocumented projects created the wristbands. Sadie created a Party as Protest vinyl record and compilation of protest songs by Chicago musicians. So the 2 graphics that we created are part of the kit. And then William Estrada created these screen print posters that say vote for our futures, vote for our children, our community, and for those who can't. And he created these in 8 different languages, where we include 2 in the kit. And then you also have a choice of a protest banner, because my other project is called Protest Banner Lending Library. So where people can request to either have a official and official voting station banner or a Let Us Vote banner. So I created 50 of these kits with the idea that anyone can request them. And as of now, 48 kits are out and being activated. So here are some different sort of activations, right? So this is for To the Polls, the Mural Arts Philadelphia put this installation up in Love Park. Here was a Wide Awake Chicago event on October 3rd, and that's William Estrada voting there. Here's Carol, who will probably talk more about the project. So here's Carol's activation and our collaboration here. And actually with Weston, I'll be doing an installation of the project at Southern Exposure with related tactics as part of that installation as well. And then in addition, and I'll end on this, due to the pandemic and concerns of accessibility of the project, me and a Chicago-based new media artist, John Satram, we created this website, officialunofficial.vote, where you could vote in 8 different languages. You could vote on candidates, vote on issues, write in your own issues, vote on other people's issues, vote on other people's candidates. And under the ACT section here, a lot of those collaborative artist projects that were made for the kit got digitized and put and made accessible on the ACT page. And so here you're able to see different people's responses to I'm voting here because and their votes. So ultimately with this question, I'm asking, what can voting look like if it were made more accessible? And the project at its core is a collective art project making disenfranchisement visible and fighting against it in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Aram. We'll get into all of those nuances in a little bit. Carol, we will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much for having me here today and for choosing to be here despite your million hours of Zoom meetings. So I'm going to share two projects that I work on as a cultural organizer based in Los Angeles, Tongva land. So one of my hats is the Chief Ray of Sunshine at the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture. And we're not an official department. I always like to say we're an imagining of a federal agency if it actually functioned. And the truth of that has gotten a little bit too real in the past 4 years. So when COVID-19 hit, as an organization with the name U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, we started to get invited into a lot of high-level conversations about what economic recovery for artists look like. And there were a lot of arts organizations and policymakers who were trying to put forth, like, what does a cultural New Deal look like? What does a public service jobs program look like? And in all of those conversations, there was a theme of we need to put artists back to work. Which is not something that I necessarily agree with, because from my perspective during this pandemic, artists have been working. Artists have been setting up mutual aid programs. Artists have been teaching Zoom workshops for their neighbors' kids. Artists are some of the people who are actually innovating on how to create connection in a really disconnected time. And so that was the genesis of the People's WPA program. It's a way for us to tell the story of 25 badass artists who are being the change that they want to see in the world now, and utilizing their work as examples of what we should be pushing for if we're thinking about a public service jobs program. And so the People's WPA is organized around 7 different themes that reflect the way that artists are shifting their work right now. And we want to think about art beyond, just a painting on a wall. Not that there's anything wrong with that, right? But we're thinking about artists that are working with modalities of healing, artists that are doing food security work with nourishment, artists that are working with incarcerated individuals when it comes to liberation, climate justice work and regeneration, culture-bearing work and remembering, truth-telling, and deepening democracy. And so this is a multiple project over the course of the year. We just went through 300 applicants of people wanting to make the world a better place. And so we'll be announcing our cohort soon. Creating a publication based on their work, and this publication will include a policy cookbook where, in essence, we'll look at policy platforms that are put forward by the Cultural New Deal, but also by organizations like Movement for Black Lives and Poor People's Campaign, and really utilize that combination of policy cookbook as well as exemplary artistic practices to provide a toolkit for people to advocate for a version of the People's WPA at the local, state, or municipal level. So instead of a government kind of handing us recovery from top down, we're asking the question at U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, how do we start to imagine recovery from a grassroots perspective and start to support these practices from a bottom-up perspective? Another project that Aram shared a little bit about is Moto Voto. So let me go ahead and present. So Moto Voto actually began in 2017 when my dad and I were in Yangshuo, right outside of Guilin, China, and we rented scooters for 40 RMB. And the woman who rented it to us said, this handle means go and this handle means stop. And off we went. And so it really inspired me to think about two-wheel transportation as an Asian characteristic, because I feel like as Asian artists, we just get pigeonholed into making art about food and like language loss. So I would prefer for us to bring the motorcycle in there as a uniquely Asian characteristic. And I grew up in Texas. So I grew up basically with gerrymandering, all these awful gerrymandered districts as a topic every single election cycle, and really seeing voter disenfranchisement happen in the South through gerrymandering and multiple other ways. And so my initial thought for Moto Voto was, I'm going to take people to the polls on the back of a motorcycle as a performance about voter access. And then, of course, no one's hanging out with anyone during COVID-19. So Moto Voto is retooled to think about the motorcycle as a way of exploring spatial inequality, but also as a way of providing mutual aid. So launched during a pivotal election year where the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inadequate infrastructure of the US sociopolitical system, Moto Voto harnesses the power of motorcycle culture to create a roadmap for social change. And without all that verbiage, we basically just ride bikes and do good. And this is my premise for a motorcycle gang. And so the different proposals I have for mutual aid on a motorcycle are taking people to and from the polls, distributing informational flyers, delivering groceries, delivering food and water to protest, taking people to and from a protest, organizing informational rides about the history of neighborhoods, organizing a fundraising ride for your local bail fund, and organizing informative motorcycle maintenance and civic democracy maintenance clinics. And so the first iteration of Moto Voto is a collaboration with Aram. It's the unofficial, I can never say this right. It's the official, unofficial motorcycle voting station. And so in this iteration, the top box of the motorcycle, which is a storage box, becomes a ballot box where people can pick up goodies, information, hand sanitizer, because that's the world we live in right now, as well as cast an unofficial ballot, either physically or online through a QR code. And so I am popping up these voter stations all around Los Angeles, and also using it as a way to get out the word about Measure J, which is the city of LA's defund the police participatory budgeting measure.
Thank you, Carol. Weston, we're ready for you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think Brian is going to be bringing up my slides. Great, thank you. So I'm going to be talking about the work of Related Tactics, which is, as Megha said earlier, is the collective that I'm a part of. We're a collective of transdisciplinary artists of color creating work at the intersection of race and culture. And the other members of Related Tactics that you see here are Michelle Carlson, who's an artist, writer, and professor of printmaking at the Corcoran at George Washington University, and Nate Watson, who's an artist, cultural organizer, and executive director of Public Glass, which is a community glass organization in the Bayview neighborhood of San Francisco. And we often use text-based works, curatorial approaches, and the free dissemination of prints and other objects as the means of exploring power, equity, and social justice. And in recent months, one of the things that I've been reflecting on is that along with sort of the tangible artistic work that we, and projects that we work on, that Related Tactics has become this learning process and formation of mutual support between the three of us that's enabled by our long-term friendship. We've all known each other now for 16 years, but we choose to work together as a collective because it allows us to think through and create work around the issues that we engage with, at least partially in the public sphere. Next. And I also want to acknowledge that I'm honored to be on this panel with Aram and Carol because they both played a role in collaborating with us in past projects. And most of our work is in dialogue with other artists, designers, cultural organizers who've helped shape our ongoing work. And so Carol with Michelada Think Tank was part of one of actually our first project together as a collective, and then Aram was through Cute Rage Press was part of one of our most recent projects. So it's kind of bracket a lot of the work that we've done to date. Next. So our current project is a project called The Future Now, which is a site-responsive series of posters that will be installed in storefronts along the 3rd Street corridor in the Bayview neighborhood in San Francisco, and it's a project curated by Asha Superrock. And this is a project in progress, so there are a lot of things that we're learning, and as it continues to unfold and starts to ramp up toward moving into the public. And as with much of our work, it's a text-based project, but it's our first neighborhood-based project rather than something gallery-based. We created it as a reflection on the histories of the neighborhood, of Black life in the city, and the state of national politics. And as a neighborhood project, it's very strongly driven by the relationships that Nate in particular has built in the community in the last decade, since it's in his neighborhood that he lives and works in. So it's informed by the conversations he's been having with store owners and other people that he's been in conversation with in the community. And it's also a reflection on space, neighborhood resources, and the sort of what it means to activate storefronts in this time and moment of quarantine. Next. And I think it was important for us to also reflect on the multiracial histories of the community there. It's a neighborhood that's primarily thought of historically as the African-American neighborhood, or one of the African-American neighborhoods of the city. It's the home of the African-American Culture District that recently formed about a year and a half ago. But it's also a neighborhood that's heavily Asian-American and Latinx, which is sometimes overlooked. And so I think that those histories and connections between communities, sometimes tensions between communities, were why it's a project that we wanted to engage with as a collective, and not necessarily something that any one of us would do solo. And the project launches on November 19th and will be up for several months. So it'll be a chance for us to understand how the work lives on in the neighborhoods as it sort of sits there and more people engage with it. So yeah, I just wanted to keep it brief, just since we're still learning as we go along as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Weston, so much. I know it's can be challenging to talk about projects that are still so much in formation, but it's often so useful for people to hear how a project is developing and how artists can be reflecting on it through that process. So thank you for that. Okay. To get started, given our date and very much the kind of orientation of this conversation when we were planning it for the last several weeks, I just want to start off asking you about the electoral process and kind of gauge what is your level of faith right now in our democracy and this process. And kind of specifically, Aram, with your project, I can't help but think that your project shouldn't need to exist, ideally. Or is there an idea that kind of as democracy expands, your project will contract? So can you talk a little about that? Feel free to start, Aram, but I'd love to hear from all three of you about kind of where you are in terms of this question of our upcoming election and the idea of participation.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's a valid point that the goal of my projects is oftentimes for my projects not to exist anymore. Right? So yeah, protest banner, lending library, the end goal is no more protests. We've achieved what we want. Or yeah, that people who can't legally vote actually end up we end up expanding voting rights and people are able to legally vote. But mind you, even before Trump, I was making this work, right? Because when is there a time in our near future or distant future where protests are not going to be a thing, where immigrants aren't fighting for citizenship and having to, jump through huge hurdles to answer these ridiculous citizenship questions to like try to get citizenship. Or when, yeah, I don't see in the near distant future Trump or Biden or anyone else where like voting rights will be expanded so much that everyone can legally vote, right? And so yeah, I guess like, you know, obviously in this particular moment, there's a certain, you know, aggressiveness to my work, but I've always been making this work and think that I will be for a long time.
Yeah, so maybe I can chime in. I'm actually that person on the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture team who's always complaining about the term democracy. And I complain about it because the U.S. has toppled so many non-U.S. governments in favor of trying to install democratic governments, when what that really means is like installing an imperialist foothold that actually destabilizes the lives of a lot of people. You know, and I think about the fact that Sylvia Wynter, who's a Caribbean thinker, she talks about how, you know, at the genesis of quote unquote United States democracy, Black people were not considered human, right? Like Black people were considered property instead of, you know, participants in our democracy. And so for me, I think it's really fraught. You know, I think voting is one strategy. And right now it's pretty clear that we need to vote, right? But I like to think of my work in terms of what are the ways that we find agency, both within an electoral system, but also just like within our own lives, our communities, and the groups of people that we're accountable to.
Thank you, Carl. That actually totally brings out the way that I think if I can speak at all for the rest of Related Tactics, we approach our work in that I think we center our work on communities of color because so much of our focus is the rest of the democratic process is so fraught and about disenfranchisement that all we can sort of channel our energy into is finding spaces and opportunities to encourage the voices and participation of the communities that we're in closest proximity to. And like Aram was saying, I think, you know, this is something that we've been invested in before this moment. We'll be invested in it continuing on beyond this, and that's sort of that's what allows us to move forward, because otherwise I think we would be paralyzed by the overwhelming sort of fear of the moment.
Yeah, the overwhelming kind of daunting tasks that we have ahead of us. I want to ask you all about the nature of your collaboration and partnerships in your practice, because it's such a huge part of the way each of you works, but really differently. But I'm going to try to combine two things. So on one hand, Carol, in your expanded bio, you say, we are most free when we can help others get free. And so I'd love to ask you about the nature of coalition building and how you view solidarity, which is very evident in your projects, the way you've described them. But kind of on one hand, thinking about the building of coalitions, the sustaining of those things. And then on the other, this idea of Grace Lee Boggs, the great activist and philosopher, talks about the importance of critical connections over critical mass. And so I think of those kinds of connections as fundamentally about a type of collaboration or partnership. So maybe you can talk to either one of those things. How are you working toward some idea of critical connections over critical mass? And this might be in an individual way that you collaborate with partners, artistic partners, or the public. But you know, this idea of how do you work with others, and how do you think about sustaining those practices?
Yeah, totally. So first, that phrase is obviously paraphrased from Toni Morrison, who I think the full quote is, when you get all these wonderful jobs that you've been trained for, remember that your job is actually to free someone else like not to actually rest on your laurels. And I think this has to do with how I think about Asian American, specifically Chinese American solidarity politics, because I'm sitting pretty now. You know, I have a master's degree. I'm on a panel with the Asian Cultural Council and the rest of you great people, right? That's a level of access that I have that I'm self-conscious of. And so for me, I operate from a state of solidarity politics, which is how can I facilitate access for other people. And I also really appreciate you bringing up, Megha, that it's very much rooted in relationship building and reciprocity, because, you know, I got my master's from a social practice degree program, and I feel like a lot of people hate social practice artists who go into their community, extract everything they can from the local people, you know, make a cute project and then disappear, right? I think that is like on one end of the spectrum, the critique of social practice art. And so for me, practicing that sort of reciprocity, like understanding what I am giving back to people, also understanding what people are giving to me in an incredibly generous way, right? And understanding how to maintain long-term relationships. That's a big part of my practice. And I think it really speaks to that, you know, we're on a panel in which I think all of us have collaborated together. And so this panel is actually a reflection of all of our investment in relationship building.
It's interesting when you think about collaboration, collaborative practice, that so often, I think to your point, Carol, there's sort of this idea that there's two components in it, but rarely do you talk about the differential of power or of access to resources, and what really building reciprocity looks like beyond maybe just credit, or how we can expand those ideas of what. That's why I ask about the sustainability of it, because it seems that you three are working in a long-term, ongoing way. So it's about deepening. There's something I think that ties your practices together about the deepening of something, deepening a relationship, deepening and expanding our understandings of democracy, deepening partnerships too. Weston, maybe can you talk a little bit about that, the nature of how you have collaborated with this, with related tactics, and how your relationships have changed, or how the dynamic has changed to serve the projects, or just speak to how the group has evolved?
Yeah, I think, especially in the last, well, I guess to step back for a second, I think, any long-term collaboration and relationship, there are moments where it's easier or more complicated to work out how to divide duties and to make sure there's sort of a balance of equitable labor and having this conversation continuously after and during each project. But I think one of the things that the moments where it's really felt like it's clicked recently was we recently published a sort of written graphic piece or graphic design piece that was in the New Glass Review that was called the Whiteness of Glass. And that was particularly a project that was initiated by conversations that Nate was having within the glass community, because with the rise of Black Lives Matter protests and racial justice institutional calls, I think he was being put forward and his image and voice was being co-opted and used in these institutional statements, particularly in the glass community, but in the broader craft community around equity and people's promises for ways that they would act better. And so that he was really struggling with having to push back on those things, to call them out. And so I think he turned to the rest of the team and related tactics as a way of finding support around that and trying to create a collective voice around how to critique those things and analyze those things. And so I think it's been this useful process to reflect on how to understand that even in a a self-identified collective of color, that of course those things, the identities and communities within our collective are not necessarily equal or have all balanced access to racial justice, power, and equity in that way, but that we can support one another. And Michelle and my role can be to support Nate's work, even though the conversations around those things are very specific to the field that he's working in, but that our role can be to back him up, and that those things are a part of what it means to understand being an Asian American artist, an ally, a friend, and a colleague in the work that we do. And I think that's in different ways that manifests over time as well.
So you brought up the idea of equity. And I'm curious about your thoughts about the project of institutional equity. You know, I think another kind of tie between your practices is that they have been presented and manifest in public spaces, in kind of regulated, let's say less than regulated spaces, as well as in arts institutions and other types of not particularly artist-centered spaces. What are your thoughts about the current project of institutional equity, and what do you see your role in it, if you see a role for yourself inside that? Aram, you have something.
I'm like, where do I start?
And we can take it down. I mean, yeah, that's a big question, but
Can answer the previous question with this one, right? It's like, you know, in terms of, you know, my own life experience and whatnot, museums have never felt like an accessible space, right? And so, you know, for me, especially because the people that I want to be making artwork with is, you know, BIPOC people. And also more specifically, I make a lot of my work with non-citizen immigrant groups of color, right? And those are disenfranchised who don't necessarily go to a museum or feel that those are accessible spaces, right? And so like, for me, you know, a lot of my work lives outside, right? Like you said, like I do workshops in a lot of different sort of spaces, and you know, the artwork usually goes out into these public spaces, whether they are voting stations that just pop up somewhere, or protest banners, right, that are used in protests, right? And so, yeah, for me, I mean, I'll answer the last question alongside this in terms of like the importance of collaboration. And for me, you know, collaborations are really important because, you know, I'm essentially making art with my community, right? And in many non-Euro Western cultures, art is made collectively. And these are the spaces where, you know, making art together creates spaces for knowledge, where get to connect through our lived experiences, get to share and uplift those. And in these spaces of collective making, they're radical, right? To listen, to talk, to validate each other, to share stories and resources, listen, learn about the self and others, and really also come up with strategies to like live and fight, right? And so for me, that's why, like, you know, doing these workshops and doing like, you know, pop-up voting stations and in public spaces are so important, as, you know, and I do things within a museum sphere, but also, you know, it's important for me that I also do things outside of.
mm-hmm. Do you think the institutions are changing?
No.
I think they're putting out press releases that they're changing.
I mean, like, it's been bad, actually. I've like had, you know, to pull out of a show of mine was almost canceled because the director wanted to avoid political artwork, right? And so for me, on a personal level, I see things getting worse, right? So
Yeah, I guess, yeah, I've been trying to, this is a huge question. And I think I would answer it two ways. So one of my hats is I'm an artist in residence at an affordable housing developer right now. And so a lot of my work is convincing their staff, social services, social workers, resident services, urban planners, real estate property managers. A lot of my work is trying to explain to them what art is and trying to convince them to like use art in their work, right? And I actually find that to be an easier task than convincing artists what social justice is. Because quite frankly, I don't think not all artists go to art school to, I think, become change makers in the world. And so for me, it's actually easier to collaborate with people who think they're making change in terms of social work, in terms of urban planning, but just convince them that, yes, like arts and culture can be part of the change. And I think within arts institutions, I feel really conflicted because I think that for us, there are the visionary asks that we can make, right? Which is like divest from dirty money, diversify your board, right? Like have salary equity. I think we can make those visionary asks, but I think oftentimes they fall short. And I also want to hold space for a lot of my colleagues who are just like doing that work of budging the institution, like one small inch at a time. And I would say like that's where we are in terms like that's the difference I see in terms of the diversity, equity, inclusion question when it comes to non-art sectors versus like arts institutions.
Mm-hmm. I think that also,
and it's a useful way to think about that. Go ahead, Weston.
Sorry about that. I just also I think it's important to sort of just aggregate the idea of those institutions a bit, also because I think particularly say from like a cultural equity funding grant making model, like there's a reason why there was that fight and shift to move toward those kinds of funding rather than the throwing lots of money at large institutions to do their DEI work and slowly turn around the ship. There are community-based, small, culturally specific organizations rooted in communities, and that I believe in that kind of institutionality. Not that those are perfect, and those certainly also need to be held accountable, but I think institutions are important in the sense that they act as anchors within these communities that live beyond generations and can pass on that knowledge and seed the next generations of artists of color and folks in these culturally specific communities who are marginalized from those larger institutions like we are. And so I want to make sure that those folks get the resources and that we're not pulling the energy toward changing the large institutions that aren't necessarily going to turn around and do that work for us.
Yeah, totally, completely. There's a couple of questions coming in through the chat, and I welcome anyone to please put a question in if you have one, but very much related to what you're saying. Many of the projects that we're talking about, some of yours, but then also the way artists are working at this very moment, kind of related to the pandemic, are taking place in spaces that have to be accessible safely, more or less, which just means, outdoors and public spaces. Can we continue to occupy these alternative spaces in the future? Maybe adding on to that, is there value in that, given that so many people don't really see themselves belonging to and connected to the cultural institutions that we already have? So this is kind of a question of, I don't know, has this been a bit of an opportunity to kind of reclaim and reconnect with public space in a kind of way in the absence of cultural institutions that have solved their problems?
I think our publics are actually getting smaller. And I say that as it relates to policing and policing in the United States, and specifically the way that like pandemic related policing is, happening, right? So as someone who works a lot with publics, who thinks a lot about like community spaces on the neighborhood level, I actually think one of our tasks as artists is to think about how we remake publics in the wake of COVID-19. And I also say that, once again, with my community development hat on, I've seen small businesses shut down, right? Like the local mom and pop shuts down while Walmart stays in business. And I think that also affects our understanding of like public and collective ownership over a place too. So I don't know. I mean, I do think that there's an opportunity in like pivoting from the way that traditional arts institutions have functioned in, I think, very like exclusionary ways. But I don't necessarily know that we're experiencing an expansion of publics right now. I might argue the opposite.
Yep, that's a great point. That's a great point. That they're getting reshaped and being through policing are fundamentally contracting. So another question coming through, we've kind of talked a little bit about it, but this relationship between community organizing practices and methodologies of community organizing, which influences and has an impact on your work, all three of you. Do you see community activists and organizers involving artists more so and approaching the work in a more interdisciplinary way? So do you see your project, Carol, of describing what art is in the affordable housing realm? Is that inspiring people to want to work with artists more?
No. Well, because we have a reputation of being extractive and wanting to do our own thing, So I think I'm also, going to maybe refer to one of the questions from Marina in the Q&A, which is, I think it takes a lot to build like goodwill and good faith relationships with community collaborators. And for that reason, like the projects I work on are probably at least a year, if I were to actually focus on building a good faith relationship. But even then, I think community organizers can be suspicious of artists, and I think they have their reasons for being that way. I don't know what it's like in Shy. I heard Shy is a utopia.
It's different, right? In terms of, I still get that. Like, I have certain projects, like art can do this sort of change and, create, or let's do this because art can have this sort of impact. And, some people meet me with like excitement, and some people are like, we're very busy doing mutual aid and art. We can get to that maybe later, But, I think like, I work a lot with, or an organization I really love is NACASAC, and they are based here at HANA Center. And I, reach out to them over the years, many, many times. And they did a march last year called the Home is Here March. And it was like a march to defend Daca and TPS, and it was a coalition of organizations that walked, that did that march from New York to DC. And for that, I knew that they were doing it, and then I reached out to one of the people I knew, was like, okay, can I like make you guys like 20 banners and give it to you guys? Will you guys want that? And they were like, yeah. And they actually carried the banners throughout the whole march, and it was one of the main like art visuals, right? And so like the photographs from media and the impact of the banners, it sort of surprised them, right? And I had this conversation with my friend who works at the HANA Center, right? And so like we've been sort of talking through that in terms of like, wait, why were those banners so impactful? And like, like so many people came up to us and took photographs. And so that is a relationship I've developed where like, we're sort of, we're trying to do more things together. Right. But I think like, in different organizations, it's hard to sort of be like, okay, let's do art now because people are so overwhelmed doing like, you know, providing basic resources for people where they're sort of like, wait, does art have a space in this when like people don't have homes and need to be fed and, you know what I'm saying? And getting sick. So I understand.
And in many ways, those organizations, like for me, what some of the art is the envisioning of different ways, different methodologies and strategies to reach people. That's kind of very much part of the artistic process. So people are engaged in that kind of thinking already.
But it is hard, especially in this moment, right, to prioritize art, especially for these orgs when like they are literally like responding to like these terrible crisis after crisis, right, in terms of like, yeah, people's lives being completely uprooted and yeah, so like the envisioning, I think that's actually what happens with trauma, right? That's actually what creates trauma, right? Is that like you can't envision, or like you don't have the space to envision because you're just reacting because you have to, right? And in that book, The Body Keeps the Score, like that, he talks about Vessel, whatever his name is, he talks about how like that he sort of sees that, or he defines that as PTSD, right? Like in terms of like, you can't imagine a different alternative because you just keep coming to that same thing over and over again, right? And we are living in a society where it's traumatic, you know? So when will we have access to art, which is healing, you know? When can we prioritize art? We can because we comfy, like Carol said, but you know, anyways.
Yeah, that's a good moment to begin to close on. Does anyone else want to have any last thoughts or ideas about that? Or anything else you want to share? Somehow we got to the end of this, but there's so much more we could talk about. So we'll have to do a part 2. But any last thoughts? Anything else to share?
If you can vote, vote. If you can't.
Oh.
Vote.
So many great questions.
Oh, well, there's another coming through too. Maybe we can just end on this, I guess. Well, I guess the question of, as urban, city-based artists, how do you address the urban-rural divide in your work? Do you do that in any of your projects specifically, or do you feel like it would require kind of the movement of yourself outside of the urban space to be able to do that?
I think what I was going to say in regards to the other question was that the thing that I find the most, and I think this is something that I respect a lot in Carl and Aram's work as well, is that it's really about living as an artist in the world, in the sense that our role is not limited to or always the most useful being legibly artists, and like trying to have these relationships driving toward something that, you know, it's kind of like community organizing in general, right? Like that really it's about being in the place, forming relationships, having that be organic, making yourself useful in whatever variety of ways. And then if that moves toward an artistic project or outcome, then that's something. And I don't think that's always the case in the work that I do or Related Tactics does, but I think that's something that at least informs parts of our work in the broader sense. And so I guess for myself personally, I don't know that I would be able to embark on that kind of urban rural work without spending time in those spaces and doing that work. So it's not something on the immediate side, but I'm always curious to know people who are doing that work successfully.
Yeah. All right. Aram, Carol, Weston, thank you so much for this, taking the time. We're going to close this conversation here. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I'm going to turn it back over to Cecily to close us out.
Thank you so much, Megha. Thank you so much, Aram, Carol, Weston, Hyde Park, everybody, for this extraordinary work that you're doing. I think you have spoken really eloquently to the necessity, the essentiality of the kind of work that you all do as social practice artists, and the contributions that you're making right now to our democracy, to our ability to act in this country. And we really are grateful to you for your work. So again, we could talk for another several hours, but we're going to close this one up, and we do encourage you to join future In Dialogue presentations. Our next one is going to be hosted by our Taiwan office on October 22nd with curators and architects Oliver Essler and Wang Chung Sheng. So until then, be well, thank you, and see you next time.